Hi, good morning. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Caitlin. So we have a huge group today, which is awesome. I'm going to kind of go over some basic housekeeping things before we get started. So this will go, I'll probably go for about between 40 45 minutes because I want to add some time at the end for some questions if people have those. What I will say here, I'm going to jump to the next slide because it has a few kind of things to keep in mind when you're looking at your end of the webinar. So one thing I like to make sure to remind people up front is don't use the hand raising feature because of how many people are attending today. I think we had over 300 signed up. There's really no way for me to keep track of who raised their hand or being able to, have those questions sort of answered in real time. So don't use that feature because I don't want you to feel like you're being ignored. If you have a question, either a technical issue or a question about content, type that into the questions section. So you'll see that sort of on this right side of the slide here where there's that drop down, that little section that says questions. If you type in a question into that, I'll sort of keep that up and keep an eye out on that. So if there's anything that comes up, send it that way. I will get to as many questions as I can. Obviously, I probably won't be able to get to all of them just because of how many people are attending today. If I see something pop up in that questions box while I'm providing, the actual doing the webinar, going over content, and it seems relevant right at that time, I might just answer that question right then. But a lot of times it's going to have to be saved till the end. The other thing that I want to remind people of, because I want to try to add as much or actually eliminate as many barriers as possible to people engaging in the webinar. So if you type in a question, I won't say who asked it. So what I'll say is just, I see a question here, this is what it's asking, and then I'll answer that, but I'm not going to say who sent that in. So it will be anonymous in terms of who's asking the question. So if that was any possible barrier to typing in a question, hopefully that eliminates any concerns about that, some, anonymity there. So you can see over here too, you can kind of minimize or maximize that control panel with that little orange arrow. But hopefully that's kind of clarified some of the general logistics of it. And then, I'll jump back here just for a second for those of you who have just joined. Obviously, we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. We could talk about this for much longer than 45 minutes. I totally understand that. Hopefully, I'll give sort of an overview, some actionable items to take away, and again, some question time at the end. Briefly, my background, so I've been with Cascade for 6 years. I've been a clinician for over 10. I've done a lot of teaching. That's primarily what I do now, but also done years of clinical worked with groups, individuals, both in mental health treatment and drug and alcohol counseling. My background is in trauma psychology, but a lot of what I do now is talk about this topic as well as other topics as well. I'm really glad that we're spending time to have this conversation. So why don't we get right into it? I know people are still sort of joining as I'm talking, and I know everyone has a busy schedule. So for those of you joining, again, type in questions in that question box if you have them, and then we will get right into it. The other thing, I think we are going to jump straight into a poll question. So before I jump to that slide, with polls, you're going to see a slide that has a static version of the poll question and answers, and then I'll launch the actual live version of the poll that you can provide your answer. Again, those are also completely anonymous, and so that's kind of how that's set up. So let's talk about objectives, and then we will jump to that poll question right after that. So thinking about kind of the general objectives of today's webinar, I want to definitely spend time clarifying and kind of explaining the difference between systematic and systemic. And we'll see how many times I say those words today in today's webinar, but it's a very, very important difference between the two, and having an understanding of how those play out in the workplace, and certainly they play out not just in the workplace, but for today's discussion, focusing on that workplace dynamic and how that relates to equity and inclusion. And then, when I talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, so much of what I spend time on is understanding the language that we use, because the way that we talk about ourselves, other people, systems, situations is so much going to be related to how we feel about them, think about them, etc. And so when we think about a safe workplace, when I talk about the idea of safe in this context, I'm talking not necessarily just about physical safety, but social safety, emotional safety. So the word safe is really much more of an umbrella term that's defining beyond just physical safety. And then some actionable steps. So, what are some things to consider? What are some takeaways of kind of now what? So hopefully you will walk away with some actionable steps and ideas to kind of move forward. Okay, let's jump into, speaking of that, we're going to jump into, actually, why don't we, I'm trying to think here. Let's actually start with this poll, and then I'm going to jump back to the slide after that. So this poll question, again, is asking each person, I can think of one or more actionable steps that I've taken to improve equity and inclusion in my organization. I'm asking this up front before I even define what these mean to kind of see how people are feeling about it. So I'm going to launch the live poll. Okay. So you should see the live version of that. If you can take a moment to answer those. Again, this is optional. If you're willing to answer it, that's great. And these are anonymous. So if you participate in the poll, the answers are completely anonymous. We have about 75% of you have voted already. That's wonderful. I'm going to give it a few more moments for people to think about how they would answer this. Right, we have about 80% voted. I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds here. Still have a few people voting, so that's great. Okay, so I'm going to close out the poll. We had 85% of you vote, so I'm going to share the results here. All right, you can see what I'm seeing. So this is wonderful. So we have almost 75% of you have said agree to this. That's great. Some have said disagree, and some have said unsure. So there's no right or wrong answer to this. A lot of, we'll have a few poll questions later in the slides as well. So much of what I think is important about doing polls is validating where we're at, and we may feel like the only one, or that no one else is thinking about this. A lot of people are thinking about this and at different kind of stages in this process. So just kind of a normalization, validation of where people are at, and also just to give you kind of a sense of even thinking about how you would answer that. So I think it can just be a helpful way to engage in that. Okay. All right, so let's talk about understanding the workplace environment. So starting with, what are we talking about with systematic versus systemic? So when I think the easiest way to kind of describe that is systematic is more of when we're looking at things in kind of a concrete way. So systematic might be a specific policy that's in place. It could be a law that's in place. Let's see. All right, sometimes there's a lag with going back to the slide. I think you can see the slide that I'm on now. Okay, so an example, a fairly current example of this is that very recently there was, the government made a decision to make it illegal to discriminate against LGBTQ individuals in the workplace. So that was a systematic change in terms of a law being passed. Systemic is essentially that even though a law like that's passed, doesn't necessarily mean that every workplace now is inclusive, open to LGBTQ community. So there's kind of the policy side, the concrete changes in terms of laws, policies, and then the underlying system of people's opinions, people's biases, systems within organizations, social dynamics, all of that. So that's where it's like we're kind of looking at these two sides, and both are equally important to look at. And I think as HR professionals, you're in this extremely unique position where you're very aware of both. But what I see so often in, it feels like a long time ago, but I used to almost exclusively only teach these trainings in person to groups of people. And, it's seeing that groups will say, we're trying to improve retention, we're trying to make these changes in our organization, and we've felt like we've made some systematic changes. I certainly will give some concrete examples here in a moment. But we're still having issues with retention. We're still like, why aren't these kind of changes bringing about either the retention or the workforce diversity that we're looking for? And my argument is that because the systemic side of it still has some things that need improvement. So I encourage everyone, today as we go through here and then beyond just today's webinar, to really kind of look at that for your own specific organization, of thinking, what systematic things have we done or could we do? And then what can we try to do to address the systemic pieces of that? So we'll talk about that. And in most cases, what I hear is certainly that the systemic side can be a lot more complicated and difficult to address or know how to address because it's not as concrete. So I wanted to share that up front so we kind of all know what that means. And then there's also the question of equity versus equality. So this is, they're very different. I put this quote up here. I'm not going to read the slide. Everyone can read that quote, but I think it makes a good point. So one example that I was talking to someone at a different organization a few years back when they were talking about equity versus equality and sort of what their organization does, is they were describing how, a lot of times companies will say we're equal opportunity employer and we post our applications all through, say, for example, like LinkedIn or Indeed. And this organization, they were like, we took an extra step and we actually also have like hard copy paper applications, because what if someone doesn't have access to a computer or access to apply online? So that's one of many sort of concrete examples of the difference between equity and equality. So equality is all the applications are online, anyone can apply. Equity is thinking there's different ways that we can offer the ability to apply to an organization to be able to meet people's needs and where they're at, and what works best for them in terms of what options they have to put in an application. So, and I'm seeing, so on my side, just as a heads up, because I know some people have joined later than the first couple slides when I started, if you click the hand raise feature, I really have no way of tracking who's raising their hand and why. So I'm not ignoring you if you're raising your hand. If you have a question that you have about the content or any technical issues, type that into the questions box and we can try to get to that either now or at the end of the training if it's a content related question. So I'm going to go through some examples as we go through this webinar of other systematic changes that can improve equity. But sometimes people obviously ask, how are we describing equity versus equality? One other quick example, if we're thinking about this, to me just kind of stuck out as like an easy example to understand it in school settings. So equal treatment of students would be every student gets the same lecture. Equity is thinking students learn in different ways. Some students learn by hearing it, some by, like doing the task, some by seeing visuals. So there's like auditory learners, visual learners. So an equitable classroom would provide learning possibilities in all of those ways, not just one way. So that is kind of how we're describing that difference there. And I think companies are really at a point of thinking, what does being proactively equitable look like for us, rather than just everyone's treated the same, every policy, everything's exactly the same. And that's not necessarily being able to promote that next level of an equitable workspace. All right, so we did the poll. Let's jump to the next slide. I have two slides of some definitions. This is from, again, doing this training very often. I've taught not only to, certainly not just HR professionals, but people in all levels of organizations. So supervisors, managers, HR, all staff on equity, inclusion, and diversity. And very commonly what comes up is people just aren't aware of or educated on some of these concepts. And I think especially in HR, it's being able to, if we are wanting to promote equity and inclusivity, really the first part is thinking like, how am I educating myself? Am I taking the time to be educated on these terms and understanding individuals and where they're coming from? So this is, an overview. And again, there's a couple slides of definitions. This is just the first one, but this is often very confusing to people. So that's why I wanted to put this up here. And again, I'm not going to read every word on these slides. Part of why slides like this have all of these words to define this is that all of you have access to these slides, and you will have an access to a PDF version of it. There'll also be a recording, but I like to offer people something that's tangible enough that even if they were to just look at the slides later, they have that as a resource or a reference point. So you can kind of, if you want to, look at that again or continue to educate yourself, you have access to that beyond just a live webinar. And yeah, exactly. So you'll all have access to those slides. And so frequently we get questions about how these different definitions differ. So hopefully this clarifies this. And then as we talk about kind of the systemic things that we're looking at to try to improve, so much of this is like, how are we all educating ourselves on this so we can have a more appropriate conversation? Okay. So we've had a lot of questions recently about what this first acronym stands for. So I wanted to make sure that people know what it stands for. So that's Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. I think we have been seeing that acronym more often, and I'm glad that we are having a conversation about racism and both systematic and systemic racism. And there's all sorts of other, communities, demographics that are experiencing discrimination. So I think it's always an important time, but such an important time to really have this conversation, educate ourselves, be willing to talk about this, be willing to actually be making actionable changes. So I want to talk a little bit about privilege and intersectionality, because this is really where it comes in when we're thinking about those systematic changes. So I am going to read this one on privilege. So privilege is how we're defining it here as advantages that people who are part of a socially privileged group gain at the expense of those who are not, regardless of economic position. I did a training or webinar a couple weeks ago specifically just on racial injustice and talked a lot about white privilege. If you want more time spent on just specifically that entire webinar is on Cascade's YouTube channel if you're interested in learning about that in more detail. With this, of course, we're talking about this on a larger scale of multiple different social groups who are not part of the privileged group. So here's a couple examples, because I think that what people hear when they hear privilege is they hear economic privilege, and that's not what it's talking about. So often people are saying, are you claiming I didn't earn what I worked for? Nope, that's not what we're claiming. Or are you claiming that I'm somehow economically privileged? Nope, that's also not what we're saying. So here's an example of privilege. So if you've never before had to consider if a building you're going to is wheelchair accessible, that's a sign of privilege. So that's nothing to do with saying that you have any type of, economic privilege. It's the things that people within a socially privileged group don't have to think about, don't have to worry about. And there's tons of examples. And so this is where it's understanding on an HR perspective, like how that plays into the systematic and systemic changes. And so whether we're talking about privilege as a whole, which is what we're talking about today, again, I go into a lot more detail about white privilege specifically in that other webinar if you're interested in learning more about it. But this is something that affects people within groups that are not part of the privileged demographic. So basically, if you're not white, if you're not a cisgender male, if you're able-bodied, all of there's a number of different ways that a person could be privileged. And this is where we talk about intersectionality. So if, for example, there's an individual who is a cisgender female, who is African-American, and who is in a wheelchair, they're falling under multiple demographics that are not part of the privileged group. So how is that affecting the way that they are treated in society? How is that affecting, their experience in the workplace? So it's being able to look at this from multiple different perspectives and not just linear of like each specific kind of privileged group or non-privileged group, because all of us have different backgrounds and different components of us that might fall under a socially privileged group and a not one. So I think that this is a conversation we have to have and to think about. What I will also say that's really interesting, that was interesting about the other webinar I talked about, is when I started talking about privilege and started talking about white privilege, that's when the most questions came in. Is people can often become very sort of uncomfortable with even starting to think about this when they are part of one or more privileged demographics. It's hard to look at that. We can start having emotional reactions and feelings about that is uncomfortable. Part of that is learning to sit with that discomfort and educate ourselves and have open communication with others, learn more about this, learn how this affects us and the people around us, because not talking about it or not learning about it isn't going to help us or anyone else. So this is really about that self-awareness piece that comes into play. And I'll say this later in the training as well, but we have to model the behavior that we're looking for. And so if we want to have self-aware individuals who communicate respectfully and appropriately in our workforce, we have to also be learning how to do that and modeling that behavior. So the more we educate ourselves, the better, because part of that is also just modeling the importance of that. I also, again, realize that every one of these slides could be an entire training in and of itself. So in terms of just focusing on time, I'm going to jump ahead and talk about some systematic considerations. So again, systematic is that kind of concrete changes, like what can we actually change within policy? How does this look in real time? So from an HR perspective, there's the recruiting side. And I think a lot of organizations are having to look at some of these processes, just in terms of how can we expand how we recruit people? What is the process we're in now? This is the most cliche quote, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's like doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. So a lot of times it's thinking we may have to actually sit and implement different, completely different ways or parts of the process that we're doing, do things differently if we want things to change or be more inclusive or equitable. So one thing that I hear a lot in organizations when they talk about this, or just from my own experience of people I work with, or in the workplace in general, is so often people get a job because they knew someone. We hired or we interviewed a bunch of people, but we hired the person who knew or had a connection to so and so, or some type of personal or professional connection that they knew. And I'm not saying that that's never okay to do. This is more just a space to start kind of taking a look at what the process has looked like so far. And if it's always kind of been that, there's this sense of, what is kind of the pool that we're pulling from looking like? And does everyone look like us? Or is this kind of the sense that we're always kind of just hiring or recruiting people that know someone? Is that actually widening our lens to be able to recruit differently? And I think that in every organization is different of how they recruit, the experience background that's needed. But I know that some organizations have thought, we've kind of only ever gone to, say, for example, job fairs at certain universities or colleges. We need to maybe think about outreach or attending at different locations, different organizations, different schools, and how is the system that we've been doing right now working or not? And then this, I hear a lot too, is the sense of sometimes applications will say, and I think all of us have either seen this or know what I'm talking about, where the application will be like entry level, or the job posting, entry level position, and also needs 10 years of experience. So people get caught in this really difficult place of how do I sort of get my foot in the door at an organization or a career when I'm stuck in this place. And I hear this from a lot of people of, how do I get an entry-level job if all of them are still saying I need all these years of experience? And this is where I think a lot of times what happens is that people get their foot in the door because they know someone. So it's deciding, again, every organization is different. I realize that there's different necessary requirements of maybe certifications, et cetera. But sometimes it is being able to take a step back and thinking, what are the requirements in this job expectation versus, the position that it is in the organization? How do we help people get their foot in the door, and what is the interview process like? What is required as part of that application? And how are we kind of measuring someone's likelihood to be successful in this job or in this field? And is there ways to kind of look at that differently or do that process differently? So these would be systematic changes to consider. The other thing too is people say we really want to be equitable and hire a diverse workforce, and then you go on their website and every single image on their website is a bunch of thin white people, mostly men. So if someone is looking for a job or they're looking to apply at multiple different organizations and they go on all of their websites to do more research and they're seeing those types of images, it's going to project a concern that maybe they are not as equitable or as inclusive, aware of differences, and promoting an inclusive environment. So that kind of first thing that people see is really important. So how is a website set up? How are the promotional materials set up? If a website has videos on it, are there closed caption for people who might have a hearing impairment? There's so many levels of things that we have to consider if we truly want to be inclusive and equitable. We can't just say that we are. And I mentioned this earlier, but if it's thinking, does our facility, is it wheelchair accessible? Bathrooms, and there was an image on the earlier slide of that. Do we have gender neutral bathrooms available to us? Because maybe someone comes in for an interview and they notice these things and think this may not be as inclusive an environment as I'm looking for. So what is being done on a systematic level to truly be inclusive and equitable to individuals? And someone had a question about language, and I'll definitely get into that a little bit later. So yes, every, kind of all the language we use and the way that we type things up, the images that we use, how we have videos, like all of that. So part of, again, if we're talking about privilege, is that if a person has never considered that, like, images, because if a person falls into a specific demographic where they're just usually the ones represented in all the images, it's easy to not even think of that. So again, that's a sign of privilege. So privilege is not about being a bad person. It's not about having being economically more well off than other people. It's just that ability to sort of go through the world without even noticing these types of barriers, because it's falling into that group that's represented widely. And so being able to step back and consider that specifically takes work, but that is part of pushing through that privilege or kind of lack of awareness, which no matter where we are on that spectrum, there's nothing wrong or bad about that. And this is why I did that poll question. This is just about learning, starting that process, and considering how to improve things. All right, so a couple more things about systematic considerations. I think that this is changing, which is good, but again, if internships are unpaid, a person is fairly privileged to be able to do an unpaid internship. I think more internships are paid now, which is good, so I do think that's changing, but that would be another sign of privilege. So a lot of people find their way into a career because they did an internship first, but if they were able to financially just not be paid for an internship. So thinking, how are we, helping people get their foot in the door? Have we done unpaid internships before, and is there ways to do them paid? And so just all of these considerations, I realize we have almost 300 people attending today. Every organization is different. Every organization has different financial, budgets. So these are overarching suggestions to just consider for your own organization. And I think the second bullet point, everyone's having a lot of time to consider right now. I'm not laughing because it's funny, but I think it's just because we all are like, yep, we've definitely had to think about this. So a lot of people are working from home, if that's possible for them in their job, to social distance. And when and how reintegration looks is something that I think everyone's considering, especially in HR. So I think this has forced a lot of organizations to recognize the need to be able to have flexible workplace dynamics, the ability for people to work from home if that's possible for the job that they're doing. Considering as well, what does quote unquote going back to normal or sort of pre-COVID, is that what we want to do? Maybe for some people that ability to work from home has really helped with their work-life balance, and this is back to being a more equitable organization. Are we checking in with employees on how they're feeling about this if they've been working from home while this has been going on? And what can we look at in terms of flexible work schedules? The other thing too, with like breaks and lunches, another example of equality versus equity. So equality would be everyone's break is at the same time, everyone's lunch is at the same time, it's all equal. But what if you have, say, for example, a new mom who needs to pump? So maybe she needs to have breaks at different times, or her lunch hour at a different time. So that is where it's equitable practices. So being able to adjust and create an equitable, inclusive environment for people, instead of just everyone has exactly the same all the time. So considering that, the other thing too, what I'll say is kind of the last thing on this slide is that workplace social activities. I think organizations are understanding the importance of kind of a holistic wellness of their employee morale and community. We spend most of our waking hours with the people we work with. And so just considering workplace social activities. So if it's, a social activity that stays at a restaurant or bar, how often are the social activities have alcohol included in them? Being aware of that, is that inclusive to people who might be in recovery? And are there options of workplace social activities that can be different types of options instead of always the same one? Are there activities that we're doing that certain people at this organization may have physical limitations that they can't do those activities? So just being aware of that in terms of how improving morale, improving workplace wellness, because I think that piece of an organization is so important. So just kind of widening the lens again on what options there are. Okay, so let's jump in and kind of talk about the systemic barriers, again, to inclusivity. So these are the non-sort of concrete policy changes that would be the systematic, but the systemic is what gets in the way. So what happens all the time is a company will say, we did a bunch of things that were on your earlier slides. We made these systematic changes. We changed policy. We started, we changed XYZ about our website or about the building itself. And it still doesn't feel like it's a safe workplace. So everyone on some level has implicit bias. So these are very much these unconscious attitudes or stereotypes we have. I think, and probably in HR, you've heard this before, but there's so much research behind stereotyping in terms of either recruiters or people looking at applications. So they found that across the board, if people are looking at applications and the name on the application is a stereotypically Black sounding name, those applicants get significantly less callbacks or calls at all for an interview. So that is an example of unconscious bias. So oftentimes a person may not even realize that, but that's directly impacting an equitable, inclusive environment. There's also a lot of times decision-making around hiring women, and there's been research on that of fear that they're going to be less reliable because of childcare. I mean, all of these just assumptions that are made. And so all these implicit biases directly impact that. So we may think, I'm putting all these changes into place. And so this, again, might be on the hiring side, but everyone in an organization has implicit bias, regardless of whether they're on the hiring side or in any role that they are in. So this isn't to speak to just people in the hiring positions or in HR. This is across the board. So, again, there's other things too. There might be implicit bias or assumptions that a candidate who is an older candidate would be less technologically savvy. That's a bias, so we have all these kind of sometimes jump to these conclusions or assumptions about people that directly impact how we decide on hiring, how we decide on promoting. So it's not just hiring, but it's promoting within organizations. And there's so many things at play here. So actually kind of taking a step back and considering that for our own biases, and then also how is that playing out in the organization as a whole. So when we talk about microaggressions, some people are familiar with this term. Some people may not be. There's sometimes confusion about what it means because it sounds like it's just little aggressive behaviors if you were to just kind of break down the actual syntax. It's not exactly what it is. So the thing that I think is important about understanding microaggressions, they can be verbal or nonverbal, but they are very frequently unintentional. So I think that is one of the challenges, is that people will say, no one's intentionally saying things that are hurtful. No one is intentionally saying things that are racist or homophobic or transphobic. But it doesn't mean that there aren't intentional comments or things happening. So, for example, if it's a call center, like even for Cascade, if people are calling in looking to set up services, we make sure that people are trained that if someone's calling in to say set up couples counseling and they say that they have a name that's stereotypically, say, a female sounding name, the person on the phone isn't saying, oh, what's your husband's name? Like, that would be a microaggression. There was no bad intentions there, but just assuming it was a heterosexual relationship, that is a microaggression. It's making an assumption and defaulting to what sort of would fall under the privileged demographic. So it's learning how to use our language differently to be more inclusive. We also tend to go with male pronoun default. So someone may say, oh, I was finally able to, talk to a doctor about XYZ. They're like, oh, what did he say? That is a microaggression, just assuming, like defaulting to male default. So there's just a never-ending list of these, but we have to consider how we speak and how we are being inclusive as much as possible, both in how things are written out, so how our website is written out, making sure that we aren't writing he as just like an overarching pronoun for a whole group of people. So how is all of our documentation typed out or written out? How are we speaking to people? How are we communicating? This is so important. So this comes through with how we ourselves are talking, how we're training new employees, how we're continuing to train current employees. And I'll give one kind of last example of microaggressions just based on kind of the time, is I was doing one of these trainings on equity and inclusion, not to HR, but just a staff of individuals years ago, and it was in person. And I was talking about microaggressions, and one woman said, she's like, I think this actually just happened to me like a week ago, now that I'm thinking about this and kind of learning about microaggressions. And she was willing to share, and she said, I'm a veteran. I had a sticker on my car. I parked at the grocery store, got out, was walking inside, and a man walked over to me and said, thank your husband for his service. So it was a very good example, not good, but good example, I will say. And oftentimes I'll ask people, how many microaggressions were in that one statement? Because there's lots. So not only did you assume that it would have to be a man who was a veteran, not a woman, you assumed she was straight, you assumed she was married, there's all these things happening. So, and that person went out of their way to try to say something nice. So what happens is the person on the receiving end is caught in a really tough position because they're thinking, do I say something? Do I not? They were trying to be nice, or maybe by the time I'm ready to say something, they've already kept on walking, so now I'm stuck sort of carrying this feeling that is hurtful and offensive, and it's hard to interrupt these systems. So I think that the first step for all of us is to do everything we can. No one's perfect, but to do everything we can to use inclusive language and watch our own biases and be very, very perceptive of the language that we're using. All right, poll question time. Let's launch this thing. What I'm going to do before I launch it, I'm going to define colleague. So colleague is anyone on your level or sort of at a lower level position. So a colleague in this poll question is anyone who's not your supervisor or above. Okay, now I'm going to launch it. Okay. Got about half of you voted already. Give it a few more moments. Oh yeah, people are, got about 75% of you voted already. I'm gonna give it about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close out that poll. We had 80% of you voted on that. Let's see how it looks. Okay. I'm not too surprised by this. If you kind of see this, the breakdown here, it looks like 25% of you feel very comfortable, about half somewhat comfortable. I'm not surprised, and then some discomfort. But I mean, a quarter of the group still feeling uncomfortable. This is a separate training. I mean, obviously it's all connected, but we do trainings just on kind of assertiveness, communication skills, because that's where this piece comes in. So this was thinking about kind of the colleague frame. Let's go to the next poll. I'm curious what this is going to be. Same question, but if it's a boss or supervisor. So let's see how people are feeling on this one. Interesting results. We've got about half of you have voted. Okay. All right, I'm going to close out that poll. Let's see. Also not surprising. And this is where it's so much of this is thinking, you know, how is the organization top down, both promoting inclusivity and equity and also willing to get feedback? Because so often people will say, tell me how to say the right thing, or how do I communicate to other people in a way that isn't offensive? That is a very great question to ask and something to discuss. What I often say is, along with that, just as importantly, we have to learn how to receive feedback of someone telling us, I prefer that language isn't used, and if we jump to defensiveness or are unable to hear that, that again is going to sort of erode an inclusive, safe space. So, and this is very understandable, these results. It's really hard to think when would be the right time to bring this up, how would I bring this up? And so I validate that this can be stressful. And that's part of why I did these polls, is that you're not alone if it's like, I don't know how I'd bring that up. A lot of this is around using I statements. So let's look at some kind of next steps here. One thing that someone had mentioned in one of the comments that I completely agree around privilege is that it's not to say that economic privilege isn't a huge component of privilege. The reason I differentiated that earlier is that almost exclusively when I have people push back against hearing the word privilege or hearing the definition is that it tends to be, well, that's not true because I don't have economic privilege. Like, I also am struggling economically, so how can you say I have privilege? So that's most commonly sometimes the response if someone's either unsure of what it means, but that's not at all to say that economic privilege isn't in and of itself a component of privilege in society as well. So when we're thinking about kind of improving the system, like we talked about earlier, inclusive language is such a big piece of this. One thing to consider as well is something called person-centered language. And this, if it's thinking like, what do I do? What could I say and say something differently? So what we hear a lot is if there are certain diagnoses that are stigmatized, for example, if someone has an addiction, mental health, mental illness is often stigmatized. So, for example, we often hear that person is a schizophrenic, or that person is an addict. What's happening in that language is that we're actually defining that person completely by a diagnosis. So as a way to kind of consider this differently is I've yet to hear anyone, if someone had, say, a diagnosis of cancer, had someone say that person is a cancer, right? So we don't hear that. And if someone said that, I think in most cases people will be like, what? But we somehow, are willing to say that person is an addict, or that person is a schizophrenic example, for example. And what this does is it really stigmatizes those diagnoses. It places a sense of judgment on that diagnosis and then at that point about that person. So they've been reduced to that diagnosis. If we talk about people that way, we're going to, I would argue, kind of continue to promote a sense of kind of social judgment around certain diagnoses. that's not going to create a safe space for people, because if, again, microaggressions, non-person-centered language is being used, an employee is not going to feel safe to go to HR or go to a supervisor and say they need help or they need support. So it's just like every level of how are we creating a safe space. And sometimes that first step is just changing the way we talk about things. And what's so interesting, what I'll say too, when we're thinking about systems, is that I cannot tell you how many times I've presented on equity and inclusion and diversity in person at different facilities and organizations, whether it's hundreds of people there or 5 people. And it makes people uncomfortable sometimes. They don't know how to sit with information. And when people are uncomfortable or defensive, they sometimes cover it up with humor. And what I've seen is, the presentation will end and people are kind of filing out and they're like, making jokes about some of the information they've heard. And this is really the important piece of thinking, if I'm in a position of, whether a person's in a position of, superiority, like a supervisor position, or in HR who might be addressing certain, obviously concerns or harassment, discrimination. But any type of comments like that, that's what really erodes that safety. So it's understanding these systems. Like, we can just do trainings, we can create all these different, make all these systematic changes. Those are all great, but we also on a day-to-day basis need to call stuff out when we see it, not be okay with jokes about things like that, not be okay with language that's not inclusive, and take the step to actually say something, and also work on our own biases. So that is where, again, we have to model the behaviors we're seeking. So we have to start with ourselves. Part of that is regular staff trainings. What I say here too, and I don't think this is new information to anyone, but one training or one conversation about something isn't like, okay, we're good now. It's like any sense of health, whether it's mental health, physical health, or education, our company's inclusivity. This is an ongoing practice. That's where it's proactive. So, just sitting there and being like, everything's equal, it's thinking we have to actually be proactive in considering and that's why that first poll question at the beginning, what have we actually done that's like measurable, or that I can name that I did, or that we did as a team or an organization, to be inclusive, to make changes, to be intentional about those changes. So that does require work, and that's part of that willingness to do that work. So I think it's just kind of a starting point. Again, this could be, a much longer conversation, and every organization has, unique in terms of how many employees they have, the type of career it is, and field that they're in. But this goes across, all types. So starting with ourselves, how do I educate myself? How do I practice being more inclusive? And what does that look like in my organization specifically? So, again, measurable changes, that's considering, how are we recruiting? Where are we recruiting from if we're looking at, hiring people? What are the requirements on the application? And are those as inclusive as they could be? Kind of like I mentioned earlier, sometimes these entry-level jobs say they require like years of experience, and everyone's kind of stuck. And their only way to sort of get their foot in the door is that they know someone. And that's not a particularly sustainable, equitable practice. So thinking, while still being able to make sure that people have the experience needed. Again, like I said, if there's like a certification required for certain jobs or careers, I totally understand that. But just really thinking, have we always just kind of recruited from the same schools, or how many of the last few people we hired knew someone? And what does the application process look like? Is that application something that is accessible to everyone and available to everyone? And how are we providing interviews? Is the place that we're doing interviews wheelchair accessible? Like all of these things to consider. So there's so many kind of systematic changes we can put in place. All right, so we have about 10 minutes. I know there's, over 200 of you. Again, I can't get to everybody's question, but there's been a few questions that I've tried to address kind of as I've been going through here. If there's other questions that people maybe have about the content, I can get to as much of it as I can. I know it's a lot of information, or just a lot of directions that any conversation could go in, but I will keep an eye out here if anyone has any questions coming up that they may have. And if any of you, jumped in a little bit late, just as a reminder, there'll be a recording of this on our YouTube page fairly soon. So that'll be accessible to people who maybe weren't able to attend today. You'll also all get copies of PDF copy of the slides themselves. Everyone should also receive an eval form for any feedback. So those are kind of just some housekeeping things as I'm sitting and just kind of checking to make sure if there's any questions that are coming in. Let's see. Okay. Still just trying to think if there's anything else as I'm scrolling through here. See if there's any questions I missed. Someone did ask on like a website, should it be switched to they instead of he, she? I would say yes to that. I think even having he/she is very much kind of implying a very kind of rigid gender dichotomy, and gender is much more fluid than that. So I would say in terms of being equitable in writing, I would suggest using they instead of he/she. But that's a good question. Let's see. Yeah, I think that, some organizations, their website's going to have pictures of actual employees. In some cases, employees don't want to have their picture on a website. That's totally fine. I think that, the question's asking, like, is it okay to have kind of stock photos of a more diverse group on our website? And what if the company itself isn't? I think that promoting equity and inclusion and having that conversation about it is okay. And part of that's also thinking, maybe this goes back to recruiting and how have we been recruiting if the demographic of the organization looks this way. And sometimes I'll hear, well, no one from different demographics are applying, but then this is, or maybe they just don't want to work in this type of field. And I'm saying that because I've heard people say that. And that kind of goes back to, that might seem that way, but again, where are people being recruited from? Is it because they knew someone? Is it always because the organization only recruits at one university, and they need to expand and go to other places and find different ways to recruit or look for applicants? So that can be part of that process as well. Let's see, trying to see if there's other questions in here. All right. Yeah. So logistical question. When I talked about, there was other training that I provided. If you had more questions about white privilege and racial injustice. So on Cascade's YouTube page, I did a racial injustice advocacy and awareness webinar. So that's what that's called if you're interested in watching that. So someone's asking, if I made a comment that wasn't inclusive and I get called out on it, what's the most appropriate response? It's first thinking, if my first thought is to get defensive, hold that back. And then a lot of times it's first saying, thank you for telling me. I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. And in the future, I'll make sure to use different language. If you don't know what that other language should be, say, do you have suggestions of a language I could use instead? And ask for that. So that can be a way to respond to that if someone does call that out. Okay. Oh man, questions are coming in fast and furious now. And these are all such good questions. I'm so sorry if I don't get to yours. There's like over 200 people in this webinar, so I'm really not trying to ignore anyone. Okay. Yeah, some organizations, have implemented having a diversity team, and I think that if that works for your organization, great. It's not certainly a requirement. In some cases, it's not logistically possible. I think any way that people, in terms of the hiring side, can have that conversation, and then on top of that, the organization as a whole promotes ongoing education and learning about that. So I think that everyone, regardless of their background, has to talk about inclusion and equity, and everyone has a role to play in that. So if having a team to kind of lead the planning around that and how that's continuing to be actively utilized in the organization, that's great. Okay. Let's see. I would always encourage organizations to do everything they can to hire as diverse workforce as possible. I mean, there's been, I think it helps with retention. I think it helps with cohesiveness in terms of a workplace. And so, all of those things are good. So of course, I would certainly recommend hiring a diverse workforce. So there's a question here about calling out microaggressions. This is where it's the kind of tried and true I statement, because if we say you just said an offensive term, very likely you're going to get a defensive response. If people feel like when we hear a you statement, it's just like our first reaction is to be like, I didn't mean it that way, or you're being too sensitive. So a lot of times we have to speak from our own experience of like, I would really appreciate if the language that we used instead here was XYZ, or I find statements like that really offensive. It would be really nice if that language wasn't used. That whole sentence never said you. So it doesn't mean that word is like completely eliminated, sometimes just in terms of like the sentence structure. But when we start with you, or you said XYZ, or you are being, XYZ, it's just not going to get the response usually that you want. So using an I statement, speaking from your own experience, is helpful. If you have an alternative thing that could be said instead that was non-offensive, suggesting that. Okay, we have like 2 more minutes. I'm just scanning all these questions. I'm sorry, I know it's getting a lot of them. These are all really, really good questions. And I know that all of them could be like a whole discussion in and of itself. Some people have asked, I grew up in Portland and I've worked with companies locally, and they're like, well, it's hard to hire a diverse workforce in the Pacific Northwest. What I would encourage people to also consider is that diversity encompasses so many different things. And also there are people from all racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, all levels of diverse demographics. And this is where it's deciding, how do we define diversity and inclusion, and how are we, again, considering recruiting practices and taking extra steps beyond just thinking, well, we'd like to, but because of where we're geographically located in the US, it's not possible. And kind of stepping outside of that and widening our lens on what diversity means, as well as also what are we doing to recruit individuals from all backgrounds. All right, I want to respect everybody's time. Again, I'm so sorry if I didn't get to your question. I have just like a whole page of questions, and a lot of them are really long, which is so great, and I appreciate all of them. But again, I'm not trying to ignore anyone. If you have further questions, or you need anything, or you want further EAP resources, you can always go on our website. You can call the EAP and speak to a counselor if you want to. Or, as an organization, if you're looking for further trainings just specific to just your company, call us and we can work with you on that. So I don't want to say that it's not important to continue having this discussion, but I do want to respect everyone's time just for today's webinar. I cannot tell you how appreciative I am of everybody's questions they've typed in. Hopefully I got to some of them. I know I didn't get to all of them. If you have anything else that you need, you can contact us. Our information is here. And, I know I'd mentioned this earlier, but access to the recording of this and the slides will be available to you. If you need anything else, let us know. But again, I really, really appreciate everyone attending today, and I hope you have a really good rest of your week.